Good morning, macroeconomic students. I'm finally getting around to starting my lecture on, I believe I said, topic 19. So let's get into our course and take a look at that topic. Um, all right, lecture topics. Want to open exam 2 topics up in a new link. And here we go. And it's 18, topic 18. Discuss the strengths and weaknesses of using GDP data. A, as a measure of social well being of a nation, and in making comparisons of one nation to another. And C, in making comparisons of one time period in a given nation's history with another time period 100 years earlier. So there we go. Um, let's go to the PowerPoints and see what we have there for this. And here we go, PowerPoints, and log into this. Number 18, here we go. We don't have a PowerPoint really to discuss here. It's just a document that I have prepared. So let's open that document up. And oh no, let's use Word to open that up. Here we go. And it looks like I have a couple pages here of things. And basically, what we're really thinking about here is whether or not we can use GDP as a measure of national well-being or a standard of living, a measure of the standard of living of the people in a country. And most textbooks, ours included, really focus on the weaknesses of doing this. And we might want to run down some of those. There are some pretty good points here about how it is a problem using it to compare standard of living and well being. But before we get into that, let's just go up here and say, GDP is a measure of national output. That's what it's meant to be, and not of national well being, even though it's frequently used as such. And typically, when you do compare countries or between uh, one country in one year versus another, the same country in another year, we use real GDP per capita. So real GDP just means we've deflated the numbers so we can compare them across the decades. And per capita means we divide that real GDP by the population so that we can see how much of the pie each person can get. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the weaknesses. So, number one, GDP ignores non market production, say within households. Uh, for example, the work of housewives or house husbands now, doing your own repairs on your house or your car, growing your own food. So, building your own barn if you're a farmer, building your own house, perhaps. A few people actually do this. So, those activities would not be included in GDP. So, GDP would be underestimating the value of output by ignoring this non market activity. Number two, it ignores non market transactions between households. In other words, if you're working on open source software and improving it. For example, on the software I'm using to record this program on, it's OPS. Let me just open this up. Here it is. And this is OBS. And it's a bit of free software, open source. And I'm very grateful to it, using it without paying for it. So right now, there's some output not being captured from GDP. And of course, doing volunteer work, which is a huge amount of work done in the United States, especially by churches. So all of that activity is missed. You can see, ooh, we're we're really underestimating GDP here. Uh, Number three, it ignores non-monetary transactions. For example, barter arrangements, where you trade one service for another. Um, I don't think those are that prevalent, but sometimes they do grow, especially uh, in high tax regimes. And of course, when inflation might undermine the monetary unit being used in a nation. Number four, ignores underground production. Um, the production and sale of illegal goods and services, drugs, entertainment like gambling, and I guess prostitution. Um, and it also ignores unreported income from the production um, to avoid taxes. Sometimes I hire people around uh, to do work around my house. We have someone come in once every 2 weeks to clean our house. We pay cash for it. Uh, who knows? The person who does it may report this income, but maybe not. I've had tree surgeons come in and repair all the trees. Well, not repair them, but trim out all the dead wood and take care of them. They would prefer cash and even give me a discount if I pay cash. I don't ask them if they're going to file an income tax form on this, but I'm suspecting not. So, and I've even had plumbers do work here for cash. So there may be a lot of work being done without being added into GDP. Well, I'm just getting the idea that actually GDP might be much higher than how it's measured, which is all cash transactions of final goods and services. So, number five, quality improvements and inventions. So, I remember when cameras were on film, and they were very, very expensive, and TVs they weren't that expensive, but a good one like from Sony was pretty expensive. And now you can get these flat screen TVs for very little money. Cell phones used to be terribly expensive when they first came out around 1980, thousands of dollars. Now you can get them pretty cheaply. Well, I know you still pay $1,000, but adjusted for inflation, um, it would be much more. I think in class we saw that, the computer, I bought the first Macintosh computer in 1984 for around $2,000 with a printer. And when we adjusted that for inflation, the equivalent today was about $5,800. So um, those computers back in 84 added much more to GDP than the much more powerful and useful computers today. So, something's not right there. It's like we're better off today with these cheaper computers, but they don't add as much to GDP as the old, less technologically able computers did 30 years ago. Number six, it ignores bads like negative externalities, pollution of the air and streams. It ignores, and then of course some people say, well, what about cigarettes? Do you really want to include them into GDP and think that the more cigarettes that are produced and smoked, people are better off? I don't know. And what about auto accidents where cars are destroyed and we have to pay people to come and repair the roadway and take the injured people to hospitals? I guess all of that's adding to GDP. And uh, if you get sick, uh, more people are in the hospital paying for doctors and hospital services. That would add to GDP. I guess since we're going through this COVID-19 pandemic, we could say, well, they're shutting down all the restaurants and a lot of workplaces, so that's going to suppress GDP. But gosh, we're going to be gaining GDP by all the people who are going to go to the hospital. Well, they're predicting we'll go to the hospital. I see the predictions, but I really don't see the data that much. That makes you wonder about the data if they're so reticent to report it. Number 7, it ignores leisure time. So as we become more productive, the amount of leisure time we have grows. So 100 years ago, people would often work 50 or 60 hours a week. Now it's averages below 40. So there's a lot of leisure time that we've gained in the last 100 years, and that isn't added to GDP. So you can see there's all sorts of ways you can punch holes into GDP as a measure of well-being. And these all are very good points. But oftentimes, textbooks and others leave it at that and don't ask, well, is it, given all of these drawbacks, is it still such a terrible measure of well-being? Isn't it a pretty good measure? And so let's look at the strengths now of using GDP as a measure of well-being. And basically, it's summed up as that 1, it's readily available for every country, though I suppose you have to wonder about the data from some country. And even in our country, there are some questions about it. But number 2, and here we go, it's highly correlated with many measures of well-being. Number 1 is life expectancy, very positively correlated. So real GDP per capita is highly correlated with life expectancy. The higher the real GDP per capita, the longer people are expected to live. And I suppose healthily also. And the second one is infant mortality. Now, this is a negative correlation, but it's good, even though it's negative. And that is that the higher the real GDP per capita, the lower the infant mortality is. Next is access to medical care. So the higher the GDP per capita, the more access people have to medical care. Literacy, the higher the real GDP per capita, the higher the literacy rate in the country. Positively correlated. Educational attainment, the higher the real GDP per capita, the higher the educational attainment, what grade people on average attain. And in the United States, it's, well into college, like it's beyond high school, which is 12 grades, into, say, 14 grades, if we include the first 2 years of college on average, and shelter per square foot per person. So the square feet per person is highly correlated with GDP per capita. In other words, the higher the real GDP, the more space individuals have to live in. The number of cars per 1,000 people. Now, some people may think this is not a good idea, but usually they don't think this is a bad idea for them. They just are unsure if the unwashed masses deserve a car. Of course, they deserve it because they're looking out for the well-being of society. But if you just say, well, everyone's equal, and then the number of cars per 1,000 people is greater, the higher the GDP, and I would guess people think they're better off having the freedom to go where they want. The number of cell phones per 1,000 people is highly correlated with real GDP. the number of homes with running water and sewer connections, the number of TVs per household, the number of toilets per household, the number of personal computers per household. And we could go on and on and on. So once you go through this list, you say, maybe GDP does a pretty good job of comparing one country to another and measuring the well-being of people in a country and from one time in history to another. So there you go. That's the argument of the strengths. Let's go to B. When we compare one country to another, and basically we use the same strengths and weaknesses. That's what we mean, same as above. But here, if we're going to compare one country to another, we need to use some sort of index, like the consumer price index that we talked about earlier. For example, when I deflated the price of the 1984 Apple Macintosh I bought and tried to see how much that would cost in 2020 dollars, was deflating the prices so we could compare them in today's prices. And basically, you need some index like that so that you can compare, purchasing power of GDP between countries, because GDP is measured in it's a money value of all final goods and services. Now, typically, when this is done, we use exchange rates. But the problem is exchange rates really can throw off comparisons because they can wildly fluctuate. I remember back in the 90s when the exchange rate of the value of the peso fell by 50%. Well, that would mean that the real GDP of Mexico, or when you're using the nominal GDP of Mexico, using exchange rates, and I guess real GDP, would fall by 50%. But if you use purchasing power parity, which is the purchasing power of the currency, then it's not going to fluctuate that much. And so economists have developed this other index called purchasing power parity to compare GDPs between countries. And we'll see that we'll be using that soon. And as far as comparing one year in the history of a country to another, we, of course, need to use the CPI, which I talked about. It's like the purchasing power parity. But since we're using the same currency, we need to deflate the GDP statistics so that we can compare them between using the same measure of the purchasing power of the currency. It is true that it's difficult to do that because the CPI uses a basket of goods, and boy, that basket of goods can change radically over time. The CPI Consumer Price Index started being gathered in 1914, and just think of, all the things that weren't in there: radios, televisions, the telephones, I suppose even automobiles, ability to fly places. And so, the baskets are quite different. All right, let's take a look at back at this question, because I have some links here. Let's take a look at GDP facts. Let's open this up in a new tab. And where did that go? Here we go. And we will do list the GDP by nominal. Let's do it by real per capita GDP using PPP, purchasing power parity. And There we go. And so here we go. Let's bring this up. And so here, these countries have higher than $50,000 in purchasing power parity income per year. And you can see much of North America, United States and Canada has that. Much of Europe, of course, Saudi Arabia with its oil, Australia, 35,000, 50,000. Here we get down to, it looks like Mexico and Brazil. It looks like we have China here coming up. Now we're into India and much of Africa is in this region. Okay, so that's interesting. And here are the lists, and these are per capita. So we're going to take a look at GDP per capita, and you can see, gosh, a lot of the oil-producing countries up here are pretty high. Real GDPs. I believe these are per capita. International dollars rounded up or down to the whole number. And let's see, non-sovereign former. Is a hypothetical unit of currency that has the same purchasing power parity with the US dollar had in the United States at a given point of time. It is widely used in economics. Okay, so it's a PPP. And I believe this is GDP per capita. Let's find the United States to see if that's right. So where is the United States? There it is, number 10. It's the 10th highest GDP per capita at 67,000. Let's see, Qatar, Macau, Luxembourg, Singapore, Ireland. Wow, Ireland. Brunei, Norway, United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong, Kuwait, Switzerland, and the United States are about equal there. And here the United States is an 11 in the World Bank one. And in the CIA's measurement, we're down to 13. Okay, let's take a look at Gapminder. This is an interesting site. This was put together by a Swedish statistician. Come on, let's load. I think once we get into it, it'll show that GDP per capita is pretty important in measuring the well-being. Come on, what's going on here? I don't know why I'm having this trouble. There we go. So here we go. This over here you can see is child mortality. It says 0 to 5 years of age dying per 1,000 children born. So gosh, up here it's 500 dying per, that's half the children. Here it's 200 children out of 1,000. And then down here we get to 2 children. And what year do we have this in? Oh, it's 2007. And we can push this to 2018, 19. You can see that child mortality decreases as the GDP per capita goes down. Let's see, gross domestic product per person adjusted by purchasing power, PPP. So the higher the real GDP per capita, the lower child mortality is. And it's kind of fun to see what happens over the years. And I guess we can go back over 200 years and see, look at that. Gosh, 200 years ago, most countries, let's stop that, right? So, hey, we're equal. Everyone's equal here. Wow. I guess socialists would have been happy. Equality. It reminds me of someone saying, uh, I believe it was a Soviet mathematician who studied socialism. He thought that the reason people were socialists because they had a death wish. And I'm just going to connect that to this, where half the children who are born die, but it's pretty equal across the world. So death makes everyone equal. And when you think about that, that's true, is that when people die, they are now all equal to everyone else who's died. All differences have been removed. Anyway, let's continue seeing what happens as GDP grows. And you're starting to see these countries get richer and richer, and sometimes now the mortality rate is coming down, as you can see. I believe this is China, this is India, this is probably the US, if I can catch it. Yep. One of these is England, probably. Yep. So as their per capita grows, child mortality is going down. You can see really the strong negative correlation between higher GDP per capita and lower mortality rate amongst children, which is a good thing. Lower mortality rate is a good thing. Hey, conclusion here, I think higher GDP per capita is a good thing. It lowers child mortality. My brother, who is a big population warrior, population explosion, probably would disagree. He chose not to have children because he's worried about overpopulation. All right, let's take a look at some other things too here. How about life expectancy? Most people probably think living longer is a good thing, not a bad thing. Come on. There it is. And we can see in 2019, you can see a positive correlation. Here's the United States. And who has the highest longevity? Singapore. Okay. And the highest income? Qatar. Okay. Here's China, India. I'm guessing this might be Russia. Let's see, a European country. What is this one? Germany, United Kingdom, France, Nigeria. Let's see who's bringing up the tail here. Life expectancy in Central African Republic is just over 50 years. Congo, Ethiopia, what's this? North Korea. Oof. Okay. Let's see what's happened to this over history. I wonder how far back we can get. 200 years again. So here we go. It's going to be interesting when we get to world wars to watch us jump around. But everyone was pretty equal back here in the early 1800s. Life expectancy was a little plus or minus around 30 years. Now you're seeing some of the richer countries start increase their average life expectancy of their population. Ooh, which one is this? I think that was the U.S. Whoa. See that go down when we hit World War One, now World War II. Woo, okay. Oh, that's the United States. So it was England. All right. So you can see that, look at China move. Wow. From the time they adopted more market oriented policies. Let's do one more, maybe. You can open this up and explore it as much as you'd like. Um, what? Let's take a look at education. Um, about literacy. How about literacy rate for adult females? Let's see what we have there. You can see a general positive correlation. I don't think we can go back that far. Yeah, almost 45 years. Let's set that in line. In general, there's a correlation. You can see the higher the GDP per capita, the higher the literacy rate of adult women. All right. Yeah, as long as we're doing adult women, let's see about adult men. Education again, literacy, adult male. Pull it back. See what happened in the last 45 years. It doesn't look all that different than the women, really. Good. Looks like it's converging on 100%. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that because I think it shows that real GDP per capita is positively correlated with much of this stuff right in here. Let me see. Can I draw on this? Maybe not. Darn. Draw. Oh, good. But where is it? Oh, that may be the wrong one. Well, I thought I could draw. I can't. I'm not sure why. I guess I need to figure out how to turn these on. Drawing canvas, ink. Ha! Headings. Okay. All right. Oh, there we go. So anyway, the Gapminder does show, if we can move this, there you go, that these things are positively correlated with real GDP. All right. Okie dokie. I think that does it for question 19. I'm going to end this recording, and hopefully I'll see you at 1:30 this morning or this afternoon.